I would like to welcome Mr. R. Gopalakrishnan. Thank you so much for making time to be here with us and do this with Future Fast.
Thank you, Nanjunda. It's a great pleasure to make an acquaintance with your initiative.
My pleasure. So, most times, the first thing that people identify with you is the leader, which you are and you have been for perhaps longest time in the corporate Indian history. I want to start with this question of how did you approach leadership from your starting point, and how much of the change do you see as an approach to leadership in your own observation today that you have authored nearly 20 books? I think the 20th book is going to come out soon. So how do you see this transition of leadership from your point of view?
You know, everything in the answer that I state will be in the viewer's eye. I think my getting older and more experienced has also influenced my view of leadership. When I started my career, from my memory, I had this impression that a leader is a guy with steel blue eyes, barks out orders and has square jaws. He knows more than other people in the organization, and he's a bit of a feared person, feared or highly respected or whatever you want to call it. He had more time for efficiency than for people. That was right or wrong, but that was an impression. Many people still carry that impression. But instead of going through decade by decade, because I've been around for some time, it has changed. And I now see a leader, especially once you cross the middle level, quite the opposite. He doesn't have steely blue eyes. He acknowledges that he knows less than other people and that all of them together is smarter than himself. He is not so much, he is focused on efficiency, obviously, but he's also focused on effectiveness. And efficiency and effectiveness are two very different things. And he has realized this through his journey. Whereas, like when I started, I thought efficiency, being an engineer and physics student in my college days, I thought efficiency is the most important thing in life. But it is important, of course, but effectiveness is equally important. And what that brings to the personality trait is a person who can listen more than he can talk, which wasn't my image of a leader when I began. My image of a leader is that he listens to everybody and then he takes a decision. Now my image of a leader is that he listens to everybody and, if I may use the word, molds a decision, which may not be the perfect decision he would have taken all by himself. And I saw a leader in the old days as a person who had sympathy for people in trouble, and now I see him as a person who has empathy for people in trouble. So the whole scenario has changed. It's partly influenced by my own journey. It's also partly influenced by the fact that times have changed.
Right. And with the gig economy and digital economy and also nearly, particularly in India, little over 50% of the population is below 35 years old now. So how do you see this evolving? I mean, if you must be giving thought because you also interact with a lot of youngsters as well. So how do you see this evolving in future?
You know, every generation that I have been have any experience or observations of, I saw my grandfather's generation, which I saw, of course, as a child. Saw my father's generation, which I saw as a growing up adult. I saw my generation, and now I'm seeing my sons, and I'm even seeing my grandchildren's generation. Every generation is better and smarter than the previous one. Yet, the previous generation always worries about the next generation. How will they manage the way things are going? My father left the village and came to the big city for a job, and my grandfather was terribly worried about how he would manage. My grandfather would hesitate to get into a railway train. That was just something not used to. But he was worried that my father was traveling in an aeroplane. And so on. I don't want to go through generation by generation. The fact of the matter is, if I look at the last 4 generations or 3 generations where I have some personal knowledge, The next generation has by and large been smarter than the previous generation. Smarter in terms of better education, better adaptability, more ambitious. But on the flip side, more impatient. When my father retired, his pension, his last drawn salary was equal to my management trainee salary when I started, and that has continued with the next generation.
Correct.
So I have great faith in the younger generation. I don't believe anybody who says nowadays young people are like this. Sure, their attention span is shorter. They respond to stimuli differently, but that's part of the. That's why I think many older people don't spend time with younger people. You rightly pointed out. I've just come back this morning. I talked to 500 young college students in Bombay between the age of 17 and 20. I spent 1 hour talking to them. And we don't do that. We tend to treat them dismissively as little kids, which they are. They could be my grandchildren. But that's not the point. They don't know what to expect out of life, but they have ambition. So you have to channelize them. And I developed what I call the 4A program for them, which stands for the phases that they should coach themselves in. Whether they're impatient or patient is a separate matter. The first is accomplishment. You must do things and deliver so that whoever's paying your salary or the venture capital company that's paying your initial startup capital thinks you're a guy who can do things. Nobody wants a 25-year-old guy who is a talker, right? Or is an economist who can comment on the macro situation. The second phase of this, after accomplishment, is affability. Affability doesn't mean being a teddy bear. Affability means you can take decisions, but you can carry people with you. That's what I mean by affability. The third phase, which probably comes when you're 45, is advocacy. You know, people complain, government is like this, my company is so large, it is like this. That's the way Bangalore city is, which is true. But can you be an advocate for a different idea? And advocacy means you can exercise influence without power through advocacy. And then finally, when you reach some stage where people regard you as a leader, you must be appearing to them as authentic. Now, each of these is a big subject, so obviously it cannot be the. But if there is anything that you think is interesting for your audience, I'm very happy to explain it. But I have found that when I explain this to people, and it may seem the most obvious to a guy who's 60 plus or 70 plus, but it is not so obvious to a guy who's 30, right? And that's the main thing. We've all forgotten how we used to be when we were 25.
Correct.
And I just have to recreate the feeling of being 25, and I start to get answers. And I would certainly say anybody who complains about the next generation should have himself examined first, rather than the next generation.
That's so true. Well, I just want to dig a little more on how do you see this? Because I think one of the books you wrote also was about a future of work. So I also want to talk about how do you see this changing with so much of gig economy happening, where essentially already, most companies are not employing people full time. Most of them are contractual employees. And most importantly, it's the people who also want to be employed on a contract rather than have a full-time engagement. So they like to have multiple side gigs, which is actually accepted. In fact, I've had CEOs arguing that moonlighting is okay, good, as long as it's not conflicting with my business and things like that. So how do you see it from where you are today, and how you see it going forward? But how do you advise them to look at this aspect of the future where people want to stay independent?
Life is all about balancing two opposing forces. You have to be firm, and yet you have to be compassionate. You have to tell people what to do, but you must also listen to how they would like to do it. You have to be firm, but you must also be understanding. And the best training for this is to get married. Because you can't treat your spouse, the way it was in your grandfather's time or something like that, and this idea that in the old days, grandfather's time, you would go away to the farm and somebody will come and give you your food, which you see in the movies, has morphed into going away to an office and carrying food with you, to eating in the office in a canteen, to now what we are saying. So what is the issue here? People think of work as a number of calories spent in giving back to the company for a certain payment. But you're not widget makers. I'm talking of executives and people like that.
Right.
Work comprises of tasks plus relationships. And there's a tension between the two. I don't think it will survive long term to have everybody on Zoom calls and gigs and so on and so forth. There is an intimate connection between tasks and relationships. It became very, very task focused, but relationship friendly, to go to an office, talk to people, chit chat a little bit, go to lunchroom together, have a pan in the shop downstairs. That will take a little bit of a backseat. But if you never go to office, so I'm really seeing a hybrid model for the efficiency of organizations. Organizations back in the 70s, 60s, they would make monuments to their own achievements. Big headquarters on Park Avenue, in Bombay, in Flora Fountain. And those are dead. And I'm using the word dead to dramatize it. They're dying.
I get it. Right.
They're dying. And I think what's going to happen as we go forward is this tension between those who don't want to get out of home and do it all by gig, and those who do will reach a different pivot and balance. Where that balance is, I cannot tell. But I think what will affect is when people realize that the social security that they got out of going to a company. When I use the word social security, I'm not talking only of financial aspect, I'm talking about relationships.
Understood. Right.
Is something that they value. And it may settle down at a 3 days plus 2 days or 2 days plus 3 days format. But without relationships, you will not be able to do work.
Correct.
And work is not tasks. Whereas young people think work is tasks. And it's not their fault. If somebody started working 5 years, 10 years ago and you just seen through COVID, he said, if you want me to write this, I'll write it. If you want me to do this coding, I'll do the coding and I'll send it to you by email, But soon he will realize that is not so. And the time they really realize it, when they are in their late 30s, early 40s, when they realize that they are getting a bit out of date. Right now, young people feel absolutely confident, top of the world. They can do AI, Gen AI, they can do LLM, and their bosses don't understand what they are talking about. But very soon they will be in the same position. And that's when they have to reach out. Like I have to reach out and say, hey guys, tell me what the hell this actually means. How can I use this? So I think it will find the balance.
Well, I like to pick on some of the things you said, but maybe under different heading. I just want to take you to the next thing I want to ask you about is education. Of course, I can't say we, but I think we belong to different generations. But from the generation you came in, also held education very highly, primarily. So, which I think things are changing lately. But I come from the generation which is also looked at education is the first thing that one should be focused at. But how do you see from the time you came in with where your parents wanted you to acquire education and then you wanted to acquire, perhaps driven by the peer pressure of what to do or what to pick, what to choose, to today, the way it is, where people or even the corporates or companies expect that a person I hire out of college should be productive from day one. So what is your perspective on this?
I think there is a slight disconnect between education and skills. Skill is the ability to do something with your mind or your hand, and having enough background to be able to learn it. Education for the sake of education, just to get a degree, is not what my generation or perhaps even yours was raised to believe. Today I was talking with the 17 to 20-year-olds. They said, no, we don't attend college. It is not necessary. The college don't expect us, but they give us the and then we mug up and do something because that's what it's in. So this attitude to education has come not because the youngsters are to blame, because the oldies have prostituted education. Education is a cultivation of the mind, just like exercise and sports are a cultivation of the body.
Correct.
You don't have to be a gymnast, so you don't have to be a philosopher. But for Christ's sake, it's not just a question of getting a degree. Now, why has this happened? This has happened because if you think of a car wiper, earlier the wiper used to go like this, if you remember old cars.
Correct.
They used to go in a 45 degrees to 45 degrees arc when I was a kid, certainly. And now they go the full 180. Options are many more. So people can get jobs as cinematographers, they can get a job as a music director. These were not jobs. People stumbled into it. If you look at the Kishore Kumars and the Asha Bhosles, they had a good voice and they just bumbled into it. But today people actually study and do real.
Like Bangalorean Ricky Cage, who's a dentist by qualification,
right,
and he won 3rd Grammy last year for music.
So I think the old generation have to understand that the range of options open are far better, bigger and better. Whereas there's a tendency as a parent to try to influence them to become a civil engineer or a electronics engineer or a computer scientist or whatever. I mean, my children do completely different things from what. No, some of my children do completely different things from what I do. But that's part of the way things are. So I don't think it's that young people don't have a value for education. But I think the way education has been presented to young people is what requires correction. When we have made education in, especially in the urban areas, indeed in the rural areas, because there the teachers don't even turn up, I'm told. But when you made education into a sausage factory, pig in, sausage out, then how can you expect them to hold regard for it? But those families where there's a middle class value, my definition of a middle class value is a family which values education and hard work. You can have a much longer and complicated definition, but that's I'm defining. There is still a middle class. It's a burgeoning middle class, but there are many more options for the kind of education and the kind of hard work. So my daughter went and studied, after doing her graduation, she studied film editing. I didn't know what's film editing. She sits in front of a computer and various people send her raw stuff and say, this is the way we want it fast back. And she's able to manipulate the computer with whatever skills she has. And she earns a good career out of it. Right. Now, if I disregard that as not being one of education, that would not be fair. So I say, okay, good. If you can earn a living that way. I have met people, especially in the UK. He's gone and studied his BA from a good university, BSc. And I said, what do you make? He says, I'm making furniture. Yeah, he says, I'm a carpenter. In India, if you do that yet, even now, you say, what's wrong with this guy? How can an educated guy be a carpenter or a furniture designer? But that's the way it will be by the time my grandchildren are 30. That is the way they will choose careers. And I think we just have to adjust.
Well, some of these large multinationals, particularly in the technology like Apple, Google, and even Facebook, Meta, they all in study mentioned that they don't really bother or care for certificates of academics, but they only look for skill, particularly in the language software skills that they require. And they say nearly up to 20% of their workforce actually don't even carry a university certificate. So do you see such a thing in India, and how far do you think it'll be accepted more from, everybody, even homes? How do you see the middle class, which I belong to, that mindset accepting something like this?
I think it will gradually happen and it will also be accepted. There will be a bit of friction in the adjustment within the family or the circles. The reason why it would be there is because, going back to my generation, acquiring a degree was very important. Why? Because my father's generation didn't have degrees. My mother's great pride was that her son and my brother, so her sons, got a double degree. Because she didn't get a degree. She never went to college. From my time, my generation, I wanted to make sure my kids get a nice degree from a good university, preferably abroad. And they all went abroad and got a degree. But they don't think that way about their children, though their children are still, 10, 12, 15 years of age, and they may change their minds. But what is happening is you can earn a living through knowledge, which comes through degrees and formal education. You can earn a degree through skills, because a different quality of skills is coming in the software industry, in the technology, electronics industry. You're actually very skilled, and it's got a shorter shelf life, because a guy who's a terrific software coder may be useless with AI coming in.
Correct.
Or with LLM or something coming in, his skill may become totally redundant.
Correct.
So you have to understand that if it moves from broad education, in which I mean the improvement and the cultivation of the mind, that has a long effect, breadth of thinking. If you're very skill-based, that skill has to be renewed much more frequently. Young people don't realize this yet. But I'm sure that they will realize it gradually as we go along. If you're making horse whips and cars are coming, you think, well, there's the cars, but then you don't need horses anymore, so they don't need horse whips anymore. But that's the way people will realize, and they will adjust.